Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. I don't remember exactly when it was that I read V.S. Naipaul for the first time, but I think it may have been in the year 2002, so right after he got the Nobel Prize in Literature. This is the interesting part. I read him first in Spanish. My father had just gotten back from a trip and he brought me a copy of his first novel, The Mystic Masseur, which was titled in Spanish El Sanador Místico. So I guess for him it was one of those airplane reads or something. I absolutely loved The Mystic Masseur. It was amusing, simple, just full of color, and in one word I would say just endearing. So I continued my reading of Naipaul with Miguel Street, this novel slash collection of stories. I absolutely love that genre, by the way, the collection of stories that may be read as a novel because they are so closely tied together. But after that, even though I absolutely loved these two books, it was many years until I read him again. And my next step is the book that I would like to focus on today, which is A House for Mr. Biswas, widely regarded as Naipaul's masterpiece. So, A House for Mr. Biswas is Naipaul's fourth novel, and that is just impressive in itself. If you look at his previous novels, The Mystic Masseur, Miguel Street, and The Suffrage of Elvira, they make up a type of trilogy because they have a similar type of approach and a similar type of genre, subgenre, mode, whatever you want to call it. And actually, these three books have been published together in an omnibus volume. So that kind of suggests that there's something to these works that kind of unites them. I would describe them as light in tone, but just rich in color. That's what I like about them. I am a really big fan of the early Naipaul works because they paint a very vivid picture of what life is like in Trinidad and Tobago. So you have novels of manners or short stories of manners with characters that are flawed but likable. And what I mean by that is basically it's just another way of saying that the characters are real. They really seem like people who actually exist. So that is a plus also when it comes to narrating. If an author can achieve that realism, that you feel that you know the characters at the personal level. And another thing that I like about these novels is that there's just a great sense of humor to them. These are novels that they are not terribly ambitious, but they are wonderful in what they do. Now, the one that we're talking about today, A House for Mr. Biswas, is a slightly different thing. There are many of the elements, many of the themes that you will find in the previous novels, but this one just opened a new chapter in the development of Naipaul's art as a narrator. With this one, he really took off. So I was wondering, as I was trying to put this video together, how can I possibly present a personal assessment of A House for Mr. Biswas, a novel that has been talked about so much. And the figure that I kept coming back to was that of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, another Nobel laureate who also explored the results or the effects of colonialism in the Caribbean region. And believe it or not, Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, is also Gabriel Garcia Marquez's fourth novel. So you have another little coincidence right there. And many critics have said that when you read Cien Años de Soledad, you get the feeling that the previous novels, the previous books, are almost like a kind of an exercise before the first great achievement. I think when people say that, they're talking mostly about his first novel, La Hojarasca, or the second one, La Mala Hora. El Coronel no tiene quien le escriba, No One Writes to the Colonel. That one is a fantastic novella, by the way. But the first two novels by Garcia Marquez, you know what they're like if you've read them, right? They're not exactly the kind of the Garcia Marquez that we want to read. So this, by the way, when it comes to Naipaul especially, is not really a value judgment for me. I absolutely loved his first novels, and actually I will say this, initially when I was reading A House for Mr. Biswas, I found myself longing for the lighter tone of the early works and also for the more humorous approach of his previous novels. But that was just my initial reaction to it. So let's talk about the novel itself. At its most basic level, A House for Mr. Biswas is a chronicle of a man's search for a place to call his own. We have, obviously, because of the title, we can tell this house, right? This guy is looking for this space, this personal space that is going to be this wonderful house that he wants to build. As a very young boy, he is blamed for the death of his father. I'm not going to give you a lot of details about the plot. I'll let you explore that by yourself, but I'm just touching upon the more important things. And then as a relatively young man, he finds himself all of a sudden almost married, almost by accident, right? And that's his situation. The novel is basically primarily concerned with his efforts to free himself from the Tulsis, his wife's family, right? It's a very domineering family, and he feels like trapped in this the Hanuman house. So his attempts to free himself from that influence are going to be the main issue or the main focus of the novel. So throughout the novel, we see him perform a series of jobs, from sign painter to government official. And the novel begins with the announcement of his death at the age of 46. So we have one of those spoiler novels. We know how the action is in a way going to end. We know what the outcome of the character of Mr. Biswas is going to be, but we don't focus on that as we read. We focus on how things got to that point and what his life story is. Knowing that the character is dead gives us that parameter, that fixed moment of time. This is a life. It's a complete life. We don't have to worry about what's going to happen to him afterwards because his life is already done. So we can focus specifically on that time period. Now, at first, when I was reading A House for Mr. Biswas, I found it very hard to get into the novel, and that was primarily because I did not particularly like Mr. Biswas as a character. By the way, he was based on V.S. Naipaul's father, so you could say that he's a real character in that sense. And you know what? I had a very similar reaction to the character and the novel of Dr. Zhivago. Okay, it was a very, very similar reaction for me. And if you think about it, there are many similarities between A House for Mr. Biswas and Dr. Zhivago. Both of them focus on a flawed character. I would say Dr. Zhivago and Mr. Biswas are modern heroes. I wouldn't call them anti-heroes. I would draw a difference there between anti-hero and the concept of a modern hero. And they both come to represent a society or a generation. So that's one point of connection between the two novels. Both of them are episodic too. So you have a similarity also in the structure, also in the epic scope. So there are many things that you could say when it comes to connecting Dr. Zhivago and A House for Mr. Biswas. Strictly speaking, in this novel, you could say also that there is no plot, right? Maybe the same is true in Dr. Zhivago to a certain extent. And that is something that exasperated me at first, okay? The lack of plot, the absence of plot is something that I associate primarily with the novella. So when you have a 100-page, 200-page text that does not really have, strictly speaking, what we call plot, that's not a tremendous problem. When you have a 600-page text that does that, that is a different story, right? And this is almost 600 pages. We have exactly 564 pages, so it's quite a long novel. That was one of the issues that I had also with House for Mr. Biswas, why it was difficult for me to get into it at first. Because if you compare it to Miguel Street, if you compare it to The Mystic Masseur, these are shorter novels. Another thing about it was that the subgenre of A House for Mr. Biswas is the novel of the land. I have mentioned before, we call this in Spanish novela de la tierra. So, a novel of the land, but it's a realistic novel of the land, okay? And I was maybe expecting something a little bit more unrealistic. So maybe I was comparing it to the wrong books. Maybe I expected something along the lines of Cien Años de Soledad, which you have a novel of the land that is magic realism. But that's a different story. At one point, as I was reading, there was something that happened to me. There was a complete change, okay? I realized all of a sudden that I found myself caring about the secondary characters. Not so much about Mr. Biswas, but about the secondary characters. I sincerely cared about them, and I wanted to see how their lives would turn out. So I continued to read because of them. But then towards the end, once again, without me realizing when this happened, right, I found myself also caring for Mr. Biswas. So I would say A House for Mr. Biswas is a very effective novel precisely because of that, in my own personal experience. It made me sympathize with a flawed character, with a protagonist that I did basically not like. I actually disliked Mr. Biswas at first, but I sympathized with him towards the end without losing sight of his shortcomings. So, once again, I cannot pinpoint an exact moment when I started caring about Mr. Biswas, but I would say that what happened was that the novel simply just drew me into its worlds little by little. It mesmerized me in a way. So that's why I ended up liking the novel very much. A House for Mr. Biswas, just so you know, has been compared to the great 19th century novels. And I wanted to share with you a quote from this novel that is not precisely or not necessarily a very important passage or anything like that, but it deals with this connection with the 19th century novel. And I thought it was a very interesting little passage. You're going to find it in this edition on page 359. And it's a reflection on Charles Dickens. Then it was that he discovered the solace of Dickens. Without difficulty, he transferred characters and settings to people and places he knew. In the grotesques of Dickens, everything he feared and suffered from was ridiculed and diminished, so that his own anger, his own contempt, became unnecessary, and he was given strength to bear with the most difficult part of his day, dressing in the morning, that daily affirmation of faith in oneself, which at times was for him almost like an act of sacrifice. Notice how in this little passage you also find a little bit of the humor. The humor in A House for Mr. Biswas is not the same kind of humor that you find maybe in The Mystic Monsieur, but the humor is definitely there. But what I like about this connection with the 19th century novel, this idea that you can read these novels in Trinidad and Tobago and still relate to them, because these authors are exploring the good old human condition, which applies to pretty much every human being. So we have that connection, and you could apply that also to A House for Mr. Biswas. You could say that you can read this novel from any culture and still, learn a lot about what it means to be human. You're definitely going to learn a lot about life in Trinidad in this time period, but it's also, possible to transplant the action and the characters and to relate them to actions that you know, characters that you know, settings that you know. A House for Mr. Biswas is undoubtedly one of the masterpieces of the 20th century, not only in the context of literature in English, but just in the context of literature, period. This is really a masterpiece. And one of the things that I like about it is that, at least in this text, what you get from Naipaul as a narrator is a great sense of objectivity. Okay, he does not denigrate his native land. He does not exalt it. He merely presents his own impressions on it and just lets you decide how you feel about this place, how you feel about these characters. And that's a big difference that you're going to find between A House for Mr. Biswas and the previous novels, those 3 novels that came before. As much as I love those novels, we have to say, and I have to admit, that A House for Mr. Biswas shows so much more maturity. When I was reading this novel, I wanted to do a little bit of research, so I read some articles, a bit of criticism here on the novel, and I wanted to share that with you, just a couple of them. So the first one is by Maureen Warner, and it is titled Cultural Confrontation, Disintegration, and Syncretism in A House for Mr. Biswas. And in this article, Warner discusses The House for Mr. Biswas in the light of the concept of the cultural clash. That is one of the main themes for her. So she looks at local values versus European values, and how that's where the concept of syncretism comes in, right? She notices that, or explores the fact that Hanuman House represents a type of conservative environment, right? It's not a bubble because it is so permeable, and that is one of the points that Maureen Warner explores in her essay, this idea that there is no place that is completely impermeable to outside influence. So she talks about that, how it is almost impossible to resist the influence of other cultures, so that things become a type of syncretism in the end. That is the main idea of this article. And then the other one that I read is by Keith Garebian, and the title is The Grotesque Satire of A House for Mr. Biswas. So Garebian begins by saying that most people read A House for Mr. Biswas either as a tragic satire or as a comic satire, a type of absurd one. But what he focuses on is what he calls a grotesque satire, the subgenre of the grotesque satire. Now, satire is definitely present in Naipaul's first 3 novels, but I would not say that it is entirely grotesque. So that's another way in which A House for Mr. Biswas represents a departure even though it's still, linked to the previous novels. And Garebian says that the way that A House for Mr. Biswas achieves its aims, and maybe even I would say these are my words, the formula for this novel, if you will, is caricatural exaggeration plus grim humor. Okay, I really like those concepts. Another thing that he does that I thought was very interesting was the exploration of the character of Mr. Biswas as a clownish figure. So there you do have an element of the absurd, and that is one way that the novel presents that, through this absurd character, and how we end up caring about him and wanting to see what happens to him, how he ended up the way he did. So let's explore the bottom line here. A House for Mr. Biswas is really one of those novels that you must read. Okay, you have to read it, no matter what. It's one of those novels, I would say, that it doesn't really matter. Like, our opinion is, in a way, beside the point. Okay, I went personally from disliking it to liking it very much. I would not call it one of my favorite novels, but that's just my personal opinion, What makes a novel one of my favorite novels? I have no idea. I could tell you Don Quixote is one of my favorite novels. Why? I would like to explore that at one point. It would be a very personal answer, but I would say that A House for Mr. Biswas is really an excellent text, and I would even say an indispensable text, one of the masterpieces, as I said before, of 20th century literature. If you're looking for a first impression, right, or a first experience of Naipaul, I would recommend The Mystic Mazur. It's not as transcendent, maybe, or as important as A House for Mr. Biswas, but it gives you so much in the sense of the humor and the satire that Naipaul is known for. Just like A House for Mr. Biswas, it is a novel of manners and it is a satire. So you do get those two elements there, but be aware that it is much lighter in tone. So if you really want to go for the masterpiece, right, then really, by all means, you would need to read A House for Mr. Biswas, and then maybe try the later novels. The later novels are different. They do not include that element of satire that you will find in these earlier texts. So there's another departure after A House for Mr. Biswas in the work of Naipaul. If you look at novels like A Bend in the River, In a Free State, Guerrillas, and all of those, they're much more political. So that's another dimension, another step in the development of his career. But once again, if you want to start with a light tone or something, go for The Mystic Mazur. It is a very modest novel in its aims, right? But it achieves its aims in a masterful way. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend that. And I have actually given some people that novel as a gift. So, just my opinion. So those are my 2 cents on A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do you have any comments, questions, recommendations? Have you read this novel? What were your impressions on it? I would love to hear that. So just let me know. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.